What if a people whom the prophets declared would be shattered and scattered actually vanished from history in ways both dramatic and traceable, not only in scripture, but in the dirt beneath our feet and the molecules of ancient bones? They were called giants, not merely because a single champion towered over the valley, but because their cities, weapons, and wealth made them a dominant force for a century or more. Their name survives in maps and in the language of later empires, yet their distinct identity seems to disappear. The story of the Philistines is at once a tale of sea-worn migrants, an advanced iron-armed confederacy, violent clashes with Israel, prophetic denunciation, imperial pressure, and, in the modern age, a recovery by archaeology and genetics that both confirms and complicates the biblical narrative. This is the Philistines, biblical giants, and their legacy today. We begin with a simple question. How does a people rise to such power so quickly, dominate a region for generations, and then fade, not entirely into silence, but into something transformed, absorbed, and renamed? That question will carry us through archaeology and ancient texts, through the crack of Samson's jawbone and the clangor of chariot rims, to the fragments of pottery that speak like postcards from another shore. If you love deep Bible history and evidence-based faith, hit subscribe. We dive into stories like this every week. Imagine the late 12th century BCE, a Mediterranean world in turmoil. The great palaces of the Mycenaeans and Hittites are burning or emptied. Trade networks that once girdled the sea are fraying. Coastal towns are under pressure. In Egyptian records from the reign of Ramses III, there are terrifying lists. Invaders from the sea, a confederacy the Egyptians call with names that echo in our sources. Among those designations appears a name rendered roughly as Peliset, a label scholars link to the Philistines. These sources present the newcomers as maritime warriors, raiders, and settlers, people who came in ships and who, in the chaos of the age, found places to land and to stay. Archaeologists today recognize patterns that match this picture. At sites along the southern Levantine coast, places that would later be Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, a distinctive material culture appears after the collapse of the Late Bronze Age. Pottery forms and decorative motifs with Aegean affinities begin to show up in layers of occupation that date to roughly the same horizon as those Egyptian texts. Whole assemblages of ceramics, oven styles, and architectural features carry the fingerprints of a seaborne origin. They tell us that people carrying new traditions arrived and established themselves where the coastal plain meets the interior lowlands, an area of rich fields, strategic routes, and ports that connected the Mediterranean to inland trade. These newcomers did not scatter randomly.
Very quickly, they coalesced into a network of fortified towns, a pentapolis or five-city league. Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath emerge as the centers of Philistine power. Strategically placed, each city controlled access to particular stretches of coastline, inland roads, and fertile districts. They could tax trade, maintain garrisons, and project force along the plain. The biblical writers, looking back on centuries of conflict, remember the Philistines as organized and dangerous. The archaeological record confirms an organized, urbanized league. What sort of people were they? The material clues point to a hybrid society that combined foreign elements with rapid local adaptation. The pottery styles and some burial customs suggest ties to the Aegean world. Linguistic traces in a few names and technical terms hinted Indo-European influences. But within a few generations, the Philistines were living in the Levantine ecosystem and drawing on local resources. Their diet, for instance, included pit consumption at levels uncommon among their Israelite neighbors, a dietary marker sometimes used by archaeologists to distinguish Philistine households. Temples to deities like Dagon and evidence of cultic objects show a religion that was both syncretic and distinct, borrowing local gods and adapting foreign practices. Technologically and militarily, the Philistines were formidable. They had access to ironworking at an early date in the region. Iron, when it first appears, is a strategic advantage: sharper tools, more effective weapons, and the capacity to equip professional warriors in ways that bronze could not always match in the transitional centuries. The biblical text itself hints at a Philistine monopoly, or at least a superior access to metal arms, in a passage that laments the scarcity of blacksmiths among Israel's folk during the early monarchy, a complaint that suggests the balance of weapon-making and maintenance favored Philistine centers. Chariots and chariotry rings the same bell. Although the coastal plain is not ideal terrain for large chariot maneuvers the way the open plains of Mesopotamia are, the Philistines nonetheless fielded elite warrior units, and their cities were defended with massive walls and gates. Political leadership in Philistine cities is described by the term sarin, usually translated lord or ruler. These local rulers coordinated defense and diplomacy, maintained control over trade, and oversaw temple economies. They were not necessarily a unified monarchy. Rather, the Pentapolis functioned as a loose confederation of urban centers that could cooperate against common threats, but also act independently when convenient. This decentralized strength made the Philistines adaptable and hard to break in single-pitched battles. When their urban power met Israel, the friction produced some of the most dramatic episodes in the Hebrew Bible.
The period of the Judges is, in part, a record of Israel's struggle to establish itself amid powerful neighbors, and the Philistines loom large in that narrative. Judges paints a picture of a society on the defensive, tribal confederations pushed into the hill country, cities along the coast fortified and resupplied, the movement of people back and forth across the lowlands. In this environment, particular individuals rise to the surface as deliverers. Samson's story is one of those striking set pieces, a Nazirite who, in a series of theatrical encounters, strikes at Philistine strength, tearing gates off city walls, slaying scores with the jawbone of an ass, and finally, toppling the temple of his captors in a final act that kills him along with many Philistines. His legend reads like the compressed symbolism of an age, a single man's feats against a nation's apparatus. But the narrative also shows the asymmetry and the nature of the threat. Philistine urban centers, with their mounted fighters and iron blades, were a constant pressure on Israelite stability. Another sequence brings the Ark of the Covenant into contact with Philistia, and the episode functions as a theological and cultural collision. During a battle, the Ark is captured and taken to Ashdod. The biblical account then narrates a striking scene. The principal temple statue in the Philistine city falls and is found prostrate before the Ark, and the people in the city suffer plagues. The story is theological in emphasis. It's about the God of Israel asserting supremacy, but it also captures in historical reality. Military confrontations produced raw contacts and exchanges, sometimes violent, sometimes contaminated by the vicissitudes of war and disaster. The presence of Israel's sacred object in Philistine hands is a symbolic reversal, and the narrative treats it as a crisis point that provoked both fear and theological reflection. By the end of the period of the Judges, the Israelite tribes increasingly ask for centralized leadership. The demand for a king grows out of a desire to meet Philistine pressure with a coordinated national response. The emergence of Saul as Israel's first king and the military contests that define his reign are inseparable from the Philistine challenge. We read of border skirmishes, of raids and countermoves, and of calculated risks. Jonathan, Saul's son and ally, is credited with bold strikes that break the Philistine stranglehold in certain areas, and those victories are narrated as turning points. Yet the Philistines remain a relentless presence until a shepherd-turned-warrior named David appears on the scene, and with him arrives the famous confrontation with a single Philistine champion, Goliath. Before we reach that iconic moment, it is important to grasp what being a giant meant in the ancient world.
The Bible gives Goliath's height in cubits and spans, a measurement that, in translation, becomes a debated figure, and in any case signifies a man who towers over ordinary soldiers. But the label giant applies on more than one level. The Philistines were giants in military organization, in their technological advantage at key moments, and in their influence on regional politics. They were giants in the way their cities loomed at the edge of Israel's territory, shaping economic flows and cultural exchange. Yet being a giant does not make one immortal. Over time, external pressures and internal processes shift the fortunes of nations. Empires rise and fall, cities are sacked, populations move, and identities transform. The biblical prophets, writing centuries later, do not merely record defeats, they speak of judgment and desolation with theological urgency. They pronounce verdicts against coastal strongholds and predict ruins where once were temples and marketplaces. These prophetic texts are theological interpretations of historical decline. They frame political catastrophe as divine judgment and, in doing so, orient later readers, both religious and secular, toward expectations about the fate of those cities. Archaeology gives us a parallel kind of testimony. Excavations at Philistine cities reveal cycles of destruction and rebuilding, phases where foreign material culture gives way to local styles, and layers that indicate both continuity and disruption. City walls are raised and rebuilt with new plans. Pottery styles shift. Religious installations change. At some sites, clear discontinuities in burial practice or architecture suggest episodes of violent overthrow or major social transformation. At others, the picture is more gradual. Newcomers and locals intermarry, craft traditions merge, and generations later, the cultural markers that once identified a distinct group blur into the broader fabric of the Levant. The story is not one of instantaneous erasure, but of assimilation and absorption, sometimes accelerated by imperial policies. Assyrian campaigns in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, for example, deported populations and reshaped demographics across the Levant. Later, the Babylonians exerted decisive pressure, and Persian administrative reorganization reframed the old city structures within imperial systems. Following these imperial layers, the Hellenistic age brought widespread cultural blending, and the Roman period applied its own overlay of names and administrative categories. One of those Roman-era labels, Palestina, used to describe the broader region, preserves the memory of the Philistines in a name, even if the people who once carried that name had largely ceased to exist as a coherent ethnic group. All of that, however, belongs to the latter parts of the story. For now, our scene remains concentrated on the rise, the settlement, and the collision.
Consider the image of a pottery workshop by the shore. Hands shaping bowls whose designs echo maritime motifs, the kilns glowing at night, the sound of oars in the harbor as merchants unload amphorae and metal goods. If that seems romantic, it is also real, and it helps to explain how the Philistines became what they were. Their coastal position gave them access to trade networks that ran across the Mediterranean, and that commercial connectivity translated into wealth and the ability to arm and sustain urban populations and militaries. The Philistines' religious life deserves attention because it shaped identity and community. Archaeological remains indicate cultic installations and objects associated with deities whose names appear in both the Hebrew Bible and in other ancient sources. Dagon, for example, a deity associated with grain and fertility in some texts, crops up in the accounts of Philistine religion and in the temple scenes. The cultic sphere was not merely devotional in the abstract. Temples were centers of economic activity, sites of pilgrimage, and places where political authority was reinforced. Destroy a temple, and you unsettle a city's coherence. Language and names leave subtle signals too. While the Philistine tongue is not preserved in lengthy inscriptions, a scattering of personal names, terms, and loanwords hint at an origin outside the Semitic language family dominant in the Levant. Scholars detect possible Indo-European roots in some ononastic material and technical vocabulary. These linguistic echoes support the archaeological verdict: initial settlement by groups with Aegean or seaborne connections who then adapted to their new environment. This hybrid quality is central to understanding why the Philistines both stood out and integrated. They were at first foreign enough to be recognized and feared as outsiders, and yet soon enough they intermarried, traded, and merged biologically and culturally with their neighbors. That does not make their initial identity irrelevant. Rather, it shows how identities can be robust in creation and yet porous in time. When the Philistine cities clashed with Israel, the battlefield was not only physical but existential. The biblical accounts of Samson, the Ark, Saul, and Jonathan are more than stories of skirmishes. They narrate a prolonged encounter between an emerging national consciousness and a rival urban culture. The narratives shaped Israel's memory and theological imagination, portraying Philistine power as a crucible through which God's people are tested, chastised, and eventually led toward unity under a monarchy. Take Saul's reign as an example. The difficulties Saul faced, internal dissent, the challenge of mobilizing a traditionally tribal society for sustained warfare, and the problem of supply and armament in a contested corridor, reflect the structural military advantages that the Philistines enjoyed.
Saul's inability to decisively neutralize the Philistine centers during his tenure is part of the reason Israel clung to a decentralized model. The demand for a king was, in the writer's view, a necessary adaptation to external pressure. Jonathan's feat, which is told as a daring strike against a Philistine outpost, becomes emblematic of the kind of bold leadership needed. But such dramas also underline the recurring theme. A people can be technologically superior, well-positioned, and politically entangled, yet still vulnerable to shifts in leadership, tactics, and fortune. And then there is David, introduced as an underdog from the hills, a man whose rise begins with a single lethal confrontation. The David-Goliath narrative compresses a cultural and military encounter into a human-scale showdown, an Israelite youth versus a Philistine champion, an intimate tableau that symbolizes a larger transfer of power.
Yet the story also preserves a historical truth. The Philistine cities did not collapse in one day. Rather, the ascent of Israel under David and successive rulers involved campaigns, sieges, and political maneuvers that gradually eroded Philistine autonomy. Even as we narrate these episodes, the archaeological record speaks in its own language. Excavations at several of the key cities revealed defensive walls and gates whose architecture can be matched to episodes of warfare described in the texts. At Ekron, for example, inscriptions and urban stratigraphy show a city that played a central role in coastal politics. At Ashkelon and Ashdod, monumental remains tell of wealthy coastal hubs that controlled seaborne traffic. In many of these places, layers of ash and rubble align with historical horizons known from both local and imperial sources. Pottery sequences allow archaeologists to trace cultural shifts. Aegean-style ceramics give way to locally produced wares decorated with hybrid motifs, a sign of cultural blending. Yet there remains an important nuance. The archaeological voice is not always a direct interpreter of prophecy. While layers of destruction may match prophetic declarations of ruin, the reasons for those ruins are multifaceted. Military defeat, economic downturns, environmental stress, or imperial resettlement policies can all contribute. Prophets read such events theologically. Archaeologists chart the material traces. Both perspectives are valuable, but they operate with different aims. Our task is to hold them together without forcing one to do the work of the other. As the Iron Age progresses, imperial forces from the north and east begin to press in. Assyrian kings conduct campaigns across the Levant, deporting populations, restructuring administrations, and installing client rulers. These imperial movements compress the possibilities for city-states that once enjoyed a measure of autonomy. The Philistine cities respond in various ways. Some resist, some adapt, and some are uprooted.
The cumulative effect is the erosion of the political structures that once made the Pentapolis a unified threat. But before empire finishes the job, there is that human drama that captures imaginations across millennia. The figure of Goliath, the textual moment when David steps forward and strikes down a Philistine hero, is not merely a story told for delight, it is a theological and political commentary. It narrates the coming of a new form of Israelite authority capable of contesting the coastal cities. It also, perhaps, foreshadows the shifts in the region that would be carried out not just by kings and prophets, but by imperial logistics and by slow, demographic processes. Here, then, we pause to consider the strands we have already woven. A seaborne origin that explains distinct pottery and some burial practices, a coastal Pentapolis that consolidated power and wealth, military and technological advantages that made the Philistines feared, and a series of confrontations with Israel that both shaped national identity and paved the road to monarchy. We have traced the physical remains, walls, pottery, temples, alongside textual memory. But questions remain. How precisely did the Philistine identity dissolve into the wider Levantine mix? What role did imperial deportations play versus gradual assimilation? How do genetic studies, limited though they are, inform or complicate the story? And finally, what does the survival of the Philistine name in later designations, like Palestina, tell us about memory and erasure? The answers require us to move from narrative and material culture into the realms of imperial chronologies, prophetic literature, and ancient DNA, a convergence of disciplines that both illuminates and constrains what we may confidently assert. In the chapters that follow, we will look more closely at the imperial pressures that bear upon Philistia, examine the prophetic corpus that pronounces its doom, and enter the laboratories where bones and genomes offer new data points. We will be careful, as both faithful readers of Scripture and responsible interpreters of evidence, to let each source speak within its strength without overreaching claims. For now, let the last image linger. The dust of a coastal road, pottery sherds sun-bleached and half-buried in the plow, the silhouette of a gate reconstructed from crumbling stones, and the memory of a champion whose shadow still stretches across centuries. The Philistines began as maritime comers. They built a league of powerful cities. They challenged Israel and shaped the nation's destiny, and in doing so, they left both scars and clues. The coming sections will track their decline, the prophetic verdicts pronounced upon them, and the ways modern archaeology and genetics shed light on the disappearance and transformation of a once formidable people.
As David moves from shepherd to soldier, and as imperial axes begin to turn toward the coastal plain,
The stage is set for the decisive confrontations that will change the landscape of the Levant. We will pick up that story next, moving from the human-scale drama of individual leaders in battles to the larger forces, prophetic, political, and scientific, that determined the Philistines' fate and their echo in later history. David's rise did not snap the Philistine world in two like a reed. It was the opening of a long season of pressure that gradually reshaped the coastal plain. His campaigns, and those of later Israelite rulers, reduced the freedom of those 5 cities and disrupted the patterns that had sustained Philistine autonomy. Yet the fall of the Philistine League was not the product of a single decisive battle. Rather, it was the cumulative effect of military contests, political realignments, and, crucially, the sweep of imperial power from the north and east. Assyria's push into the Levant in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE sharpened the conditions that would fragment local polities. Assyrian kings campaigned to secure trade routes, to punish rebellion, and to integrate the region into an imperial economy that demanded tribute and loyalty. When an empire's hand reached across the Mediterranean shoreline, city-states that had once played coastal power games found themselves constrained. Their elites could be deposed, populations deported, and local institutions restructured to serve imperial agendas. For the Philistine cities, this meant losing the freedom to act as an independent pentapolis. Their leaders became clients or vassals, and their civic economies were reorganized to feed larger state projects. Babylonian pressure followed, and with it came new waves of upheaval. The late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE were a time of cataclysmic change across the Near East. Babylonian campaigns, culminating in the capture of major cities and the removal of elites in many regions, left deep archaeological signatures, destruction layers, abrupt changes in material culture, and demographic dislocations. Prophetic books that address Philistia, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zephaniah, and Amos among them, speak in language of devastation. Cities toppled, coasts emptied, idols despoiled, markets silenced. Those texts read the collapse through theological categories. Foreign conquest becomes the instrument of divine judgment. The prophetic urgency is theological, but it is anchored in the sorts of shifts that archaeologists indeed find in the layers beneath the towns. It is important here to hold 2 truths in tension. First, the prophets proclaimed decisive judgment on Philistia. Their words are stark, and their theological point is clear. God would overturn the political order of those who opposed his people. Second, the archaeological record rarely supports a narrative of one-time absolute annihilation.
Instead, we see episodes of destruction followed by rebuilding, instances of abandonment and resettlement, and, ultimately, processes of assimilation that wash away distinctiveness over generations. The prophecies and the material record are not opposed. Rather, they speak different languages, one theological, one material, about interlocking processes of collapse, displacement, and integration. From the vantage point of material evidence, the Philistine cities survive as palimpsests. Excavations at Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath reveal sequences of construction, destruction, adaptation, and reuse. Some layers show violent ends, cast-off weapons, burned grain stores, collapsed roofs. Other layers show more ordinary continuities. Life carries on, new pottery styles appear, cultic objects change, and economic patterns shift. Among the most striking archaeological narratives is Ekron's transformation into a specialized production center. Large presses and installations point to extensive olive oil production, an economy plugged into regional trade. Ashkelon boasts monumental architecture and evidence of long-distance commerce. Gath, touted in the texts as the home base of Goliath, has a complicated stratigraphic story that reflects both prominence and periods of hiatus. When imperial pressures intensified, one of the mechanisms of change was deportation, an Assyrian and Babylonian policy of moving rebellious populations to new regions as a method of control. Deportations break the social fabric of a city. Elites vanish, institutional memories fray, and replacement populations arrive with different languages and customs. Over time, the demographic balance in key coastal towns shifted. Add to that the steady rhythm of intermarriage, commerce, and cultural exchange that naturally arises in border zones, and the path toward assimilation becomes clear. The Philistines were not simply wiped out like a footnote. They were integrated into larger imperial systems and into the ethnic and cultural tapestry of the Levant. The Hellenistic period accelerated that blending. After Alexander's conquests, Greek language, administration, and cultural forms flooded the eastern Mediterranean. Cities were refounded, elites Hellenized, and older identities either adapted to new forms or dwindled in prominence.
By the Roman period, Hadrian's administrative decision to label the region Syria Palestina preserved the ancient name and imperial nomenclature while also folding the territory into larger provincial structures. This Roman toponym is why the memory of the Philistines persisted in place names, even as the distinct Philistine ethnicity ceased to function as a visible polity. The modern recovery of Philistine history, however, came not from imperial decrees, but from shovels and microscopes. In the 19th and 20th centuries, explorers and archaeologists uncovered the coastal sites that matched the biblical Pentapolis.
They found city walls and gates, pottery that resembled Aegean forms, cultic installations, and inscriptions that confirmed the existence of local rulers and civic institutions. These discoveries changed scholarly views. No longer were the Philistines mere hostile caricatures in the biblical imagination. They were a real historical people with distinct material culture, maritime connections, and political heft. One of the most consequential modern contributions to the story has been ancient DNA. When remains from Philistine contexts were subjected to genetic analysis, scientists found patterns that clarified the demographic arc. The cemetery discovered at Ashkelon in the 2010s yielded ancient DNA samples that, when compared to reference populations, indicated a detectable early European-related genetic component among some of the earliest burials. These genetic markers do not prove myths of wholesale European colonization, nor do they grant simple answers about identity. Rather, they suggest that the initial settlers who arrived on Philistine shores carried a degree of ancestry connected to populations from the Aegean or nearby regions, consistent with the archaeological signal of Aegean-style pottery and other cultural markers. Crucially, the genomic picture changes over time. The DNA evidence points to rapid admixture. Within a few generations, the European-related signal becomes diluted as the newcomers intermarry with local Levantine populations. The result is a trajectory from distinct migrant signatures towards a genetically mixed, regionally Levantine population. That sequence, arrival, initial genetic distinctiveness, and rapid integration, fits the broader pattern seen in ceramics, burial customs, and settlement layouts. It also underscores the caution advised by scholars. Genetics can reveal movement and admixture, but it does not by itself settle questions of language, religion, or political identity. When we place prophetic literature beside this composite archaeological and genetic record, an intriguing convergence emerges. Prophets spoke of demolition and empty coasts. Archaeologists found destruction layers and demographic shifts. Geneticists documented the arrival and quick absorption of foreign ancestry. None of this proves that prophecy dictated demographic outcomes in a mechanical sense. Rather, it shows that the historical processes prophets named are discoverable and real. The convergence strengthens the credibility of the biblical horizon as a witness to events that are then interpretable with theological frameworks. Yet the story resists simplistic moralizing. To speak of prophetic vindication is not to cheer the suffering of peoples or to weaponize ancient texts for modern grievances. The Philistine narrative is a study in the ephemeral nature of political power. What seems impregnable in one century can be unmade in the next.
Empires are fallible. Seemingly stable social orders can dissolve through war, policy, and the ordinary human processes of marriage and migration. From a theological perspective, this fragility points to a divine sovereignty that transcends human planning. From a human perspective, it is a sobering reminder of how our own identities and institutions may be more contingent than we suppose. Beyond ancient events, the Philistine legacy lives on in language and in misunderstanding. The Roman label Palestina preserved the memory of the Philistines in imperial cartography. Over centuries, that name was woven into the region's geography, surviving through Byzantine, Islamic, Crusader, Ottoman, and modern maps. Names have powerful staying power, even when the peoples who originally bore them have changed or disappeared. That linguistic legacy has, at times, been used in modern political narratives to assert continuity where none can be demonstrably proven. It is essential to be clear, the current population groups of the Eastern Mediterranean exhibit their own complex histories of mixing, migration, and identity formation. The evidence does not support a straightforward, unbroken ethnic line from the Iron Age Philistines to any single modern group. That observation is both a matter of historical fact and an ethical boundary. Ancient names should not be co-opted to make simplistic claims about modern identities. Misconceptions deepen when archaeology and genetics are misunderstood or overstated. An early European genetic signature among some Philistine burials is not a ticket to modern political assertions. It is an insight into a chapter of population movement in the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age. Likewise, the survival of a toponym like Palestina does not equal continuous cultural or ethnic continuity. Responsible scholarship resists the temptation to flatten time into a single line, and instead attends to the layers, archaeological, textual, genetic, that together tell a more nuanced story. For believers, the Philistine narrative offers particular spiritual lessons. First, it affirms the Bible's use of history to teach theological truths. The prophetic denunciations that targeted Philistia assumed real political consequences. To see corroborative material evidence invites a form of humble amazement. The scriptures are not merely pious fictions, but often interlocutors with the historical record. Second, the tale of the Philistines warns against the arrogance of power. Military technology, strategic harbors, and economic wealth made the Philistines formidable, yet none of these could guarantee perpetual survival. Third, the story calls God's people to sober discernment. History is a classroom where faith is tested, refined, and deepened. There is also a pastoral impulse here. Those who read stories of devastation should not be calloused. Prophetic texts framing destruction as divine judgment must be approached with pastoral sensitivity.
The role of prophecy in Scripture is often corrective and purgative, to call communities to repentance, to warn of the consequences of injustice, and to point toward restoration. The archaeological echoes of those warnings should prompt careful reflection about justice, power, and mercy in our own age, not triumphalism. Returning to a final historical arc, the later centuries saw Philistine identity dissolved into broader narratives. Hellenistic governance, Roman provincial nomenclature, and the dynamics of late ancient society meant that the once distinct markers, pottery styles, burial customs, certain religious practices, were either subsumed into hybrid forms or replaced entirely. In the end, what persisted most visibly was a name applied to a place. That naming, preserved in imperial bureaucracies and later in scholarly works, is both a testimony to memory and a reminder that names can outlast the social fabrics that produced them. As modern readers, scholars, and people of faith, we are invited to hold several convictions together. First, archaeological and genetic work enhances our understanding of biblical narratives. It does not replace theological reflection, but offers material context that enriches it. Second, prophetic literature must be read on its own theological terms, while also being open to historical verification where appropriate. Third, caution is necessary when mapping ancient identities onto contemporary politics. History's fractures and admixtures resist simple appropriations. Consider for a closing image the profile of a coastal city caught in crosswinds of trade, war, and empire. Imagine its harbor at dawn, rigging creaking as ships load amphorae, its workshops alive with hands engraving potteries that echo styles from across the sea, its marketplaces thronged with merchants speaking many tongues. Now overlay that scene with the later silence of a destruction layer, charred beams, collapsed storerooms, a sudden gap in household assemblages. Then imagine later inhabitants rebuilding upon those ruins, altering the streets, adapting the old kilns to new styles, naming children with different names. The Philistines, giants in power, quick to arrive and then quick to integrate, left precisely these kinds of traces, the makings of a dramatic origin, the residue of conflict, and the slow erosion of cultural separateness. This story invites wonder at how ancient testimony and modern science can converse. It invites humility about the limits of our knowledge and vigilance about the misuses of the past. It invites faith that the biblical narrative, when read with intellectual rigor and spiritual reverence, remains a vital lens through which to view history. And it invites practical caution. When ancient names are recycled into modern arguments, we must apply historical discrimination and ethical sensitivity. The Philistines were giants in their day, by arms, by urban power, and by cultural visibility.
Their legacy today is twofold: a geographical name that echoes through millennia, and a complex archaeological and genetic record that tells of arrival, influence, and assimilation. In that double legacy, there is both a confirmation of biblical memory and a caution against simple readings that conflate ancient peoples with modern political identities. If this account surprised you, share the video and check the description for sources and a playlist on archaeology and the Bible.